CN8's Emmy Award-winning It's Your Call with Lynn Doyle starts now.
We have a panel of experts here with us tonight to discuss President Ford and his legacy. Let me introduce them to you now. Joining us from Boston is David Sparks. He's the Associate Dean for the McCormick Graduate School of Policy Studies at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. He was also Gerald Ford's campaign manager in Massachusetts in 1976 in the Republican primary versus Ronald Reagan. Good to have you with us. Here in the studio with me is Dr. James Hilty. He's a professor of history at Temple University. He is also a presidential scholar as well as the author of Robert Kennedy, Brother Protector. Also joining us is Dr. Joseph Marbach. He is the acting dean of the College of Arts and Sciences for Seton Hall University. And I extend our welcome to all of them. And I'm sure that they join us with the rest of the nation in mourning President Ford. If you'd like to tell us what you think, go ahead and give us a call. David, I'd like to start with you. Of course, you knew him personally, and I extend our condolences to you on the loss of a good friend.
He was a good man. I remember him, and I didn't know him all that well personally. I ran his campaign, and he was the sitting president at that time. But what always impressed me and what caused the voters to have so much respect for him is how comfortable he was in his own skin. You know, we were in a difficult time in America at that point, and here was a guy who was a substantial person and has served so many years in Congress, and he was comfortable. And I remember the time when he let cameras into his kitchen and showed him making his own breakfast, and he said he was a Ford and not a Lincoln. And he had a good sense of himself and a good sense of humor about himself. I remember once he laughed about the fact, this is several years ago, I saw him for a day at Harvard, and he laughed about how he had such a distinguished record on women's rights, and yet he had the missed opportunity of having been the recipient of an assassination attempt by not one but two women. And he laughed about that, and he thought that would poke fun of it. You
know, it's interesting that you brought that up, because I said to our guest here in the studio right before we went on the air, he was considered somewhat of a woman's president at the time, so we found it odd that he would be the target of an assassination attempt, not one but two.
Well, you know, one of the things that made him a woman's president was his relationship with his wife, and now, you know, after I've been married for a number of years, I know that you know, you can tell something about a person by the way they treat their spouse. And you know, two things. First of all, his wife Betty had breast cancer when he was president, and how they, in typical Ford fashion, dealt with that openly, and she did a lot to raise awareness of breast cancer. And then for a second act, she dealt with her addiction to alcohol and prescription medicine in such a forthright way. And you know, I know that you have an author on dealing with with president's second acts, but if you could deal with First Lady's second acts, you know, the establishment of the Betty Ford Center and everything she's done since her rehab began has got to rank up there.
Absolutely. In fact, let's talk about that here in the studio. Do you think that perhaps Betty Ford actually may have had more of an impact on more Americans than even her husband, even though he served as president?
Well, I think certainly, as far as first ladies are concerned, she was ranked among the top in the 20th century as far as the impact that she's had in a social context. And yeah, I guess you could make the argument that she's affected more people's lives because of making people aware of not only the breast cancer but the addiction. And we all hear about the stars, and they're at the Betty Ford Clinic. It's part of our verbiage today.
I guess if you have the heading of an accidental president, Jim, to start with, that kind of starts your legacy off on the wrong foot, so to speak.
Well, that's true. And one of the things that, of course, we remember about Jerry Ford is that he sometimes put the wrong foot down, and Chevy Chase made a whole career out of making fun of him. And the irony, I think, is that he's portrayed as a bumbling president, but he certainly was the most athletic of the 20th century presidents, an all-American football player, a man of grace and a physical grace. A male model was a part of his resume, which I don't think, and not even Ronald Reagan had that on his resume, but a man of articulate physical grace, too. And it's ironic that he gets portrayed this way now in our memory. The first to be publicly lampooned by Saturday Night Live and to be attacked while sitting in office. There used to be a rule against that.
Yeah, we sometimes wish those rules would be back into effect in this day and age with the media the way it is. I'm sure that people at home agree with that as well. We are inviting you to tell us what you think, so if you'd like to join in on our discussion, perhaps tell us what you recall about those days after Watergate when President Ford took office, and what do you think about the idea of having a so-called accidental president? Any of that piques your interest, go ahead and give us a call. It's odd that someone who never had any aspirations of being president would end up being a commander-in-chief, and yet, Joe, when he was there, he took that position very seriously and tried to heal this nation. Do you think that he was successful in doing that at the time?
Well, I think at the time he provided a stability to the country that we were just yearning for. You know, the one drawback and the criticism was that he pardoned Nixon so soon after becoming president, and so there was the question of was there a quid pro quo, and, you know, was this a deal that was cut? And apparently Ford claims no, it was the right thing to do, and there's a famous quote that if he could heal the country, he would do whatever he could, and he was in the one position to do that, and he saw it in the pardon. And I think, in retrospect, it was the right thing to do.
And even, David, in his last months, he said he did not regret having granted that pardon.
You know, it's interesting that as in death, you know, we talk about the Nixon pardon, but you know what a lot of folks don't remember is the fact that he formed what was known as the Presidential Amnesty Commission, and it was chaired by former Senator Charlie Goodell from New York, which was the first attempt to reach out to draft evaders in Vietnam. I mean, he had a healing nature, and you know, and it is interesting that the pardon of Nixon, when it was seen to be such a divisive act at that point, it really was part of the man's healing nature.
And yet, that was very much a part of his nature and what people remember him for. At the time, though, David, he was struggling to hold on to that position, first against Ronald Reagan, and then ultimately lost the presidency to Jimmy Carter. So why didn't the nation embrace him and thank him for being a healer? Why did it kick him out of office?
Well, I think that we touched on it. I mean, I think that it's very hard for the nation to have embraced somebody who never really exhibited any drive to be there. I mean, and we forget just how much bile was in people's throats over Vietnam, the end of the Civil War, or Civil Rights era, and Watergate. I mean, and to have Ford and essentially be a caretaker president at that point, you know, right. I think that the voters said to themselves, well, you know, that's good for an interim time, but we really do want to make a cut. And if you go from the abuses and the imperiousness of Richard Nixon to the healing nature of Ford, you know, it really was one more step on the continuum to go to the sort of down-honeness of Jimmy Carter.
Right. Well, 30 years later, we'll give people an opportunity to tell us what you remember about that time frame. Was Gerald Ford a healer? Did he change the nation? How do you remember him? As a good president, or did pardoning Richard Nixon tarnish his image forever for you? Later on, we'll also talk about which living president is your favorite now. If you want to tell us what you think, you can go ahead and give us a call, but you could also weigh in by taking our web poll, which is focusing on the best of the living presidents. We'll be back with your thoughts and your comments in just a moment. And I invite all of our viewers in Washington, D.C., the city where Gerald Ford served for so many years, to tell us what you think, as you are our featured city of the evening.